Hey, friends. So, I had a really interesting session yesterday with Katie and our couples therapist named Paolo, and this was like, it was one of these conversations that it was both hilarious and really kind of opened some new doors for me, and ultimately became a kind of reflection on the way that the universe is just constructed to promote the expansion of consciousness constantly and in all ways. And if you know how to look for it, it's everywhere, kind of thing. So I'm trying to roll this back far enough that you kind of get the gist of how I got to the moments of insight that I got to. But basically, we sat down to talk about our roles, and in a way, Katie and I are playing what you might call non-traditional, like our roles in the workforce are sort of non-traditional in a way, in the sense that Katie actually has a job that she goes out to. She leaves the house every day, goes out, and it's a job that also provides a lot for the household. I work almost exclusively from home. I mean, I'll have these projects that take me around the country or whatever, but I basically have a kind of work from home. And I would say that I also, just because of but partly because of my nature, but partly because of the way it works out, I end up doing a fair amount of kind of household duties type stuff. So there's a slight, I wouldn't say it's a full like 180 degree turn or a full flip, but there's a slight like non-traditional structure to what we have as far as like traditional masculine, feminine gender roles. And we were talking about that and just looking at that and seeing, we're kind of discussing some of what that means for us individually and how it feels, and discussing and exploring whether or not that is really an expression of our strengths as individuals, whether it's how we want to remain long term. All of that was kind of coming up for discussion, but mostly it was about, given our current circumstances, what really makes things work for us? How can we really appreciate each other's experience throughout this time when things are set up in this way? So, and I had a conversation with my coach the day before where she went really deep on this and gave me some wonderful insights. So I kind of came in to the conversation ready to have it. And so our therapist asks us, he says, okay, let's do an exercise. Think of a couple. He called it it was like an exercise where there's like a kind of traditional masculine role and a traditional feminine role. And he said, think of a couple that exhibits that relation, that exhibits that dynamic. And Katie and I thought about like our friends and family members. It took us probably a minute or two of just rifling through all the couples that we're in touch with, and then being like, no, they don't really, that doesn't really comply. No, they kind of comply, but actually, if you look at it, if you really know, then it's not really that. So there was all kinds of, we couldn't come up with a couple that we know that exhibits these roles. And our therapist was kind of like sitting here on Zoom being like, are you kidding? And then eventually he just stopped us. He was like, all right, fine. So don't worry about finding a couple. Here's how the exercise is supposed to work. You would pick a couple, and then I would asked this series of questions and basically and kind of walked us through what the exercise was going to be, which we were literally incapable of performing with him because we couldn't think of a couple that conformed to these traditional roles. And so that in and of itself was kind of a hilarious moment of realizing, like, wow, that's just it's just kind of remarkable that we don't, that things are at a place where where none of our immediate experiences, or at least none of the ones we could think of, are defined in that way. And then what came up for me as I reflected, as I just kind of sat with what we were both experiencing and we continued the conversation, I realized there's something really amazing happening here, because in a way, we're each learning what the other side of the street kind of looks like. Like, Katie said something really powerful about how, there's this kind of like in what we think of as like the olden days, you think of like the 30s, 40s, 20s, ancient times. Men came home and they had their cigar den and they went into the den after work. The men were the ones who went out and worked, and women stayed at home, and the men would come back from work and then they'd go into the den and just like want everybody to leave them alone for a while. And it was, but there's a sense there's a sense now of a kind of exclusivity or it's not, oppression is a strong word, but it's kind of like this is a man's world kind of thing, and this is a man's needs, and women often weren't invited into that environment. It was kind of like men being men in there. So what Katie realized is that's not really what this was about. This was literally about when you go out in the world and play this and really kind of have this role, you get home and you can't just immediately jump into action as the family person. You actually want some time to decompress. Now, the irony of the situation is Katie doesn't really get that, because Katie's the mom and a 3-year-old really kind of just demands her mom. And that's just the way it is. There's not a whole lot that dad can do to change that other than to take the child away for a little while and do something else, which is actually, not coincidentally, what I'm doing this afternoon. But there was a realization of, this isn't actually about like a gendered thing. It's actually about a role and the kind of like the energetic restorativeness that this role kind of requires when you play it. And I have interestingly had a kind of flip side experience where I do focus on the household a lot. I do provide certain things within the household, and I notice when those tasks feel invisible, when they feel like, oh my God, is there just an infinitely endless amount of work to be done in order for it to just look like chaos has not taken over the house? There's this endless kind of caring for the environment, to some extent for Annalise and the child, although that's definitely a shared thing. It's not like I have an outsized role there, but it's enough. It's just given the circumstances of our life, it's enough that I am learning something. I'm learning something about what it feels like to be in that role, and so this is where I was like, wow, it's so amazing that this is the expansion of consciousness, right? This is human beings being offered an opportunity to broaden our roles, broaden our identities, and in the process learn about historically kind of more compartmentalized versions of identity, and kind of there's a whole learning process that can happen there by bridging that, and by in some ways flipping it on its head. And then I in putting that all in the context of, it's hard for us to even think of a couple in which it's all one way or the other. That was the other thing. Most of the couples that I could think of, they didn't display those roles in a fixed way. There was a flux to it. There's a coming in and out of each half of the role that happens in a kind of organic and seemingly, it's not premeditated. It's just the nature of what life is like. And watching, and so realizing that that's like literally everybody I know. I could hardly think of people who weren't in the category of somehow challenging that traditional arrangement. And that was, again, just kind of like a wow. The evolution of consciousness is everywhere you look. This is literally humanity shifting. We're shifting. It's becoming normal to not be. The normal is changing, and I think it was satisfying to see that, and it was also satisfying to then kind of reflect on my own family and even my own parents and their parents, and look at where along the way those roles have actually started to blur or started to flip and then come back. I would say there's some one thing that Paulo pointed out was that it's actually healthy in a relationship to have one person being exterior and one person being interior. That means that there's a balance in that focus and attention you're kind of covered. The exterior is covered and the interior is covered. Now, if that means that you have to be locked into traditional gender roles where the man is the exterior and the woman is the interior, that's going to feel oppressive nowadays. It's not going to align with human beings' tendencies anymore, because we're not there anymore. That's not where we are. But it's interesting to kind of be able to see that dynamic not through the lens of oppression, but rather through the lens of the dynamics of what each form of service is actually about. And it's also really interesting to note that just because you need to cover exterior and cover interior, that doesn't mean that the same person has to do that all the time. That can flow, that can shift, and especially when we become conscious of that, of these needs and of what the various kind of directions of focus do for us individually and do for us as a family unit or as a community, we can start to make sure that we've got all our bases covered and actually create a healthy set of circumstances, but without the restrictions that in past times were just the way that it was arranged. It was like that's just the way it was done based on, biological and historical factors and whatnot, but those are no longer determinants in our life today. But it was just interesting to notice the ways in which acknowledging these different energies kind of had an effect on what it feels like to be doing that. It changes it. It takes it from being a kind of what feels like a personal feeling or a personal impulse, and turns it into something where it's like, oh, I see. This is something that we are each contributing to the whole. And we may be more or less suited to do certain things, or there are other things, or whatever. There's a whole kind of like slew of factors that I think come into play in determining someone's proclivities towards certain types of orientation, blah blah blah. It's a lot of gray area, but identifying, the exterior and the interior, and identifying the effect of being in each position, identifying the effect of switching positions, identifying what types of circumstances allow that switch to be really kind of seamless and fluid and kind of not too bumpy, harmonious, I guess. And what factors would make it harder? When do I get attached to my role? Do I get attached to certain types of energy focus? And it's interesting because I can see a lot of my action and a lot of my decisions through that lens, and it's clarifying, and it kind of gives me a way of holding my experience that I think is helpful to me. It actually is ultimately helpful to me. It gives me a way to embrace even more fully what I'm doing right now, and not need to not mistake a certain kind of emotional inclination to mean that there's a problem, right? That's one of the main things we want to avoid. There's no problem with this setup if it works, and if we're conscious of it, and if we can manage the effects and really kind of effectively engage, we're in good shape. Anyway, this was an attempt to unpack something that's very, kind of complicated, but I think worth considering and worth keeping in my own awareness as I go through my days, and it really helped Katie and myself align around knowing how to support each other and have a harmonious relationship through these dynamics, because those shifts they're not always easy. There are aspects of each of us that may resist them, or that may struggle here and there. So it was just fun to identify it, and it was a relief to kind of see, to be able to kind of lay it out on the desk and be like, look, here's what's happening. Now we can kind of see that we can see the arrows, the little pointy red arrows of the directions of energetic travel, and that's why that always works out that way. That's why that feels like that. It was a moment, a chance for insight. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow.